So before I start my presentation, if there is one thing that at the end of the presentation you won't remember anything else, I would like you to remember a few messages. One of them, some of them I'll repeat at the end, but the first one is Slovakia is a deeply divided country at the moment. Everything I say, there is a counterpoint, and for equal measure of one-way action, there's an equal reaction in numbers and percentages. What do I mean by that? Well, for in particular for any anti-vax and anti or pro-Russian movement or support, there's an equal amount of a silent majority or a louder minority that oppose these views. Now, with that said, I would like to proceed. Due to slight technical difficulties, I will always try and call out my next slide. So if I could move on to my next slide, and I'll start with the introduction. So when it comes to addressing right-wing extremism in Slovakia, there is no united legal definition of what extreme right-wing movement is. However, Slovak Penal Code recognizes definition of hate crime and extremism in general that include both left and right-wing extremism, and promotion and promotion of extreme acts and ideologies. The national strategy for the conceptual framework for countering radicalization and extremism to 2024 does carry a particular extreme right-wing definition, and it defines it as extremism or type of extremism that is characterized by ultranationalism, xenophobia, racism, anti-democratic and anti-systemic attitudes, and a rejection of egalitarian principles. To combat these, the Slovak government has established the abbreviation is VRAX. It's a subcommittee on the prevention and elimination of racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism, of which this author is a proud member. This committee or government committee is there to advise the government on issues and modes. It brings together representatives of the line ministries of the Slovak government, as well as the institutions, the Secret Service, the police, as well as members of non-governmental organizations, members of the public, basically. Yeah, if I could move on to my next slide, please. In terms of the historical context, where does the extreme right-wing movement in Slovakia stem from? Where does it come from? I will not spend too much time on this, but as with many Central European extreme right-wing movements, the traces can be or it can be traced back all the way to World War or just before World War II. With various pro-Nazi, there was a pro-Nazi regime in Slovakia that had its characterizations, and as well as pro-Nazi Germany puppet regime headed by a Catholic priest, which was a sort of Slovak unique thing. After the war and the defeat of fascism in our country, Czechoslovakia was re-established. Unfortunately, after 1948, this history of Nazi regime was covered over by an equally horrific communist regime that for 40 years suppressed any kind of discussions on the nature or coming to terms with our own history. In the early 1990s, there is a marked rise of nationalism that is not unique to Slovakia. That was across the region, as I'm sure you know from the previous speakers, and I'm sure the speaker after me will also reiterate this. 1990s were also a very interesting time for extreme right wingers in Slovakia. There was a whole generation of and groups. The rise of since the 1990s, early 2000s, were marked by the rise of Kotleba as a figurehead or a leader of a particular party that over the years changed and had many names and difficult and different successes or failures when it comes to entering the mainstream politics. The rise of the explanation of why extreme right-wing movement even exists in Slovakia post 1990 era lies in different economic, political, and social factors. The economic transformation of early 2000s meant a large-scale disenchantment with mainstream politics and feelings of marginalization for a large part of regional population. There was also a rise in populist and national tendencies that was specifically or targeting anti-minority and anti-immigrant sentiments. And the last driver, specifically in the last 10 to 15 years, was the rise of social media that presents a new platform for spreading narratives and providing new recruitment platform for these various extreme right-wing groups. If I could move on to the next slide, please. Now, there is nothing particularly Slovak about, or specifically Slovak about what I've just described in terms of historical context. A similar story can be traced in both Czech Republic and Hungary, that due to closeness of borders and similarity of our historical experiences. However, in terms of Slovak-specific narratives that I would like to point out, is first and foremost probably the anti-Roma narratives that are a mainstay of most anti-Roma, extreme right-wing movements within Slovakia. Roma communities have been targeted by racially motivated attacks, discrimination, and hate speech, for which several members of established political parties have now been also convicted at court. Secondly, migration and Islamophobia is a particularly strange thing in terms of the Slovak context, and this is due to very low numbers of both migrants and Muslims within Slovakia. Now, migration has become a bit of a problem in terms of rising numbers in the past 6 months. However, this does not explain the experience or the mainstay of these narratives in the past 15 years. The third factor is historical revisionism. And what do I mean by that? By that is the tendency of different extreme right-wing movements to try and explain away the experiences of the independent Slovak Republic during World War II. It has to be remembered that this regime was responsible for the deportation of 50,000 of its own citizens to Nazi death camps. So trying to explain this regime as saving Slovakia from a bigger catastrophe or from the oppression of the Czechs, for example, is what is the revisionism I'm now trying to talk about. And finally, anti-establishment. Now, or anti-establishment moods, narratives used well. These are relating to positioning as the third option, as in the politicians, particularly during recent years of COVID, anti-vaccination stance, anti-vax, as well as after the war or Russian aggression in Ukraine started, pro-Russian and distinctly pro-Russian narratives. Now, these are also not uniquely Slovak in terms of they do not occur anywhere else within the region. However, there are some things that could be pointed out as particularly Slovak or coming out of a Slovak context. Yeah, let's move on to the next slide, please. So a quick rundown of who is who within Slovakia, what groups we've looked at during our research, we've selected several of these parties, but it has to be remembered that there is the list is much longer, depending on the decade. So the original precursor of all extreme right-wing movements would be Slovak National Front, Slovak Knights, and Slovak Dawn, all now defunct movements from the early 1990s that provided grassroots organization as well as members for the later iterations. The first of which was the Slovak People's Party, or Slovenská ľudová strana, that actually entered the general election context in the early 2000s. In 2009, Slovak Attorney General submitted a proposal to the Slovak Highest Court for its dissolution, going well beyond anti-Hungarian rhetoric, and having anti-constitutional statements in the press and media. Inexplicably, this proposal was withdrawn in 2011. However, by then, this party basically broke up and transformed itself into a much more or better organized, worse iteration of itself, the Ľudová strana Naše Slovensko. Now, this particular party is quite hard to grasp on. Depending on every 3 to 5 years, this party will rebrand itself in terms of a name, but not necessarily in its symbols, and definitely not in terms of a leader that leads it. This is, of course, the Marian Kotleba, the leader of a mainstay leader of already mentioned. The biggest success of this particular party was their electoral successes of 2016 and 2020 national elections, winning 8% and 14 seats in 2016 and 17 seats out of 150 members of the parliament. So that's a substantial representation within the Slovak parliament. However, during the course of the 2020 to 2023 election period, 2 of the mandates were lost due to criminal convictions of its members, including the leader of the party itself, after which the party basically split into 2. And this is what brings us to the Republic. The Republic at the very latest election campaign, because there weren't national elections in autumn of 2023. These national elections basically preceded the writing of this chapter within our report. However, what can be said is that the breakup of Kotleba's party basically created Republic that hollowed out Ľudová strana, listeners, or People's Party, Kotleba's party, following down to below 1%. The Republic itself, in the most recent elections, ended up just under the threshold required, 5% threshold required for entering the Slovak National Parliament. It means, however, that this party will still receive funds from the government. I will talk more about financing, I think, at the next slide. Yep. But Republic basically crashed out in the last elections from the first forecast 10% to now 4.5% gained in the parliament, meaning, as I said, they did not enter the Slovak parliament, but they did qualify for state funds for the next 4 years. One of the reasons is they became too mellow, meaning they tried to distance themselves from their openly pro-Nazi and fascist agendas, trying to describe themselves as anti-fascists and anti-fascist, having anti-fascist stances, which confused their voters. And the second thing that happened to them was that other mainstream parties took over and ran with the mainstay agendas of this party, namely reproductive rights, anti-immigration, anti-Muslim narratives as well. So moving on. Nightwolves, yes, the Nightwolves, the biker gang from Russia, known for its rides across Europe, does have a chapter in Slovakia. It also represents the first Slovak on the international sanctions list. It's been active since 2011. A lot can be said for them. Their base is in Dolna Krupa, and that there were several articles in the public where it was alleged that this movement received direct funds from Russia. Mr. Hambalek even having a picture with Mr. Putin himself. Slovenskí branci is an example, and the biggest example of a paramilitary group in Slovakia that inexplicably self-disbanded in 2022. While not openly displaying open sympathies for Nazi symbolism or ideology, the links with there are provable links with, for already mentioned, night wolves, common training, and openly advocating for preparing its members for the service in Slovak armed forces, both police and the army. And finally, Akčná skupina Vzdor Kysuce is probably the smallest of this, but one of the more notorious groups, with having literature outputs, banned books, different. Its leader Marian Magat is has been indicted on 36 counts of extremism, including possession of illegal arms. So a noteworthy example of this. Moving on to the next slide, and I'll try and keep it a little brief, being mindful of time. COVID-19 is an important thing that had both good and bad aspects for the extreme right-wing movements in Slovakia. The most open one was an immediate loss of financing due to the ban of public events that before could serve, such as concerts, for example, that could serve for financing purposes. However, what it lost, they also gained in following on social media, with almost 1,600 different Facebook groups alone springing up, criticizing and rejecting pandemic measures, and having a boon, representing a boon in terms of recruitment numbers for sympathizers and direct followers. What's even more worrying is the next slide, is the vulnerability to Russian propaganda. Now, this is something that yes, here we are. In my notes, I got lost my notes there for a second. So while the approval for Putin in public polling fell from 52% positive or approval down to 28 in March of 2022, it can be said that it has since rebounded to almost pre-war levels. What I was saying about Slovakia being deeply divided is also proven by the fact that 45% of Slovaks believe that NATO, led by the US, is directly responsible for the start of the conflict in Ukraine, while 51% Slovaks openly disagree with this claim. Now, the worrying trend of taking over extreme right-wing movements narratives by mainstream parties that are now, or after the elections, represent the official Slovak government stance, is also in calls for ceasefire and peaceful resolution via negotiation as a mainstay and part of the Slovak government manifesto approved just last week, which, if maintained, is a worrying trend for Slovak government's international standing, I would say. This vulnerability to Russian propaganda existed prior to the war in Ukraine. There is tracing back all the way to the 19th century and Slavic narratives of Slavic brotherhood. The problem of not disappearing quickly is something I already covered in terms of percentages. GLOBSEC in particular is doing regular polling on this, as in vulnerability to Russian propaganda, and I recommend everyone to check out this research strand of GLOBSEC. It is well worth it, and if you're Slovak, it's well worth and very worrying. This belief is widespread in terms of belief in Russian narratives and pro-Putin narratives, basically. So let's talk about the finances on our next slide. Slovakia is slightly peculiar in terms of financing. It does not rely, it's regular or already named extreme right-wing movements that tried and form political parties do so for one of the main reasons is to receive state funding for their success in national elections. There's a percentage allocated every year for every political party that takes part in national elections and gets beyond the 3% of all votes cast threshold. This in real term numbers means that between 2016 and 2016 and 2020, 4.22 million euros was allocated for Kotlebas party, which also means 7.2 million for the next in the last 3 to 4 years. It is estimated that Republic, not Lisanasa, there's a slight mistake in this, estimated to be 1 million per annum for Republika because of their election success. This will not be going to Lidová strana Naše Slovensko, so not to Kotlebas party. There is also alleged, though not proven, and definitely nothing that can be put to a sum. Direct support between the Russian Federation and Night Wolves, for which sanctions were already put in place. Online activities I have already talked about, and can be seen more on my next slide, one to the last, I believe. So online activities beyond COVID that I've already mentioned, and the rise of which cannot be underestimated, can be illustrated on two personalities, one of which is Dani Bombic or Dani Kolar, a particular personality that also took part in the Slovak national elections. Mainstream party members from two different parties went and visited him in London, where he currently resides. He was made infamous for his doxing and publicly publicizing personal details of medical personnel that was doing the immunization during COVID. He gathered quite a following in terms of Slovakia, where 50,000 followers is quite a large following for Slovak Telegram channels. What can be said about him, or why do I mention him as an important? He's a symbol of what online activities of a single man can do beyond the powers or scope of entire political parties could do, say, 10 years ago. He is fully capable of covering by himself topics of migrants, refugees, anti-Semitism, and Roma, all wrapped up in one person, spiced up with a good heaps of pro-Russian propaganda. Which is almost impossible to remove, very hard to prosecute, and because of the fact that he's not in Slovakia, very hard to put a stop to. The second aspect is online self-radicalization that has been made possible in the last few years. That means people, especially young people, are capable of self-radicalization online without having any formal contact with any formal groupings or particular members. This was made particularly obvious in February 2023 when a lone shooter attacked an LGBTQI establishment and shot and killed two members of the LGBTQI community. He was later identified as a 19-year-old man, son of a one-time unsuccessful political candidate who self-radicalized on 4chan, of all places, blaming, even going as far as publishing a manifesto blaming Jews and the LGBTQI community on Twitter for all the bad things in his life and in the life of Slovakia. This manifesto was later dissected and investigated. It was made clear that his ideological grounding came from 2018 Pittsburgh synagogue attacks. So in my last slide, Kerry's forecasts, they are also present in the report itself. Here I would like to reiterate some of the things that are currently happening. So transformational and generational change that we could see with the split of the Republika as a party and gaining traction. It could be considered a success that these two parties, neither Kotlebas nor Republika, are currently in the Slovak parliament. But I would consider that even more dangerous, because as already shown, the finances have not been cut off, not really, and at the same time they're free to electioneer in the next round, and more worryingly, some of the narratives or main themes, such as not one more bullet to Ukraine, being tough on migration, and anti-LGBTQI propaganda, had now become mainstream for political parties that currently constitute the Slovak government. The disbanding of Slovenskí branci, or Slovak enlisted men, also seems like a good thing, and in a certain sense, it definitely is. But it leaves former recruits harder to track and trace, and may already be infiltrated within Slovak armed forces, police and army both. And finally, recent terrorist attack from February 2023 is a warning sign for the future, that online self-radicalization is a real thing, even in Slovakia. And with that, I would like to finish my presentation, and I'm looking forward to your questions.